So welcome back, everyone. In this segment, we're going to see what kind of texts the Upanishads were, and then we're going to ask why they were so concerned with these ideas of karma and rebirth. So here we go. Now remember, the Upanishads were these secret scriptures that are found at the kind of bottom shelf of each of the four bookshelves that are the four Vedas, right? Like the Brahmanas and Aranyaka texts that come before them, the Upanishads are trying to uncover hidden connections, these bandhus, between seemingly different things. But now the connections that the Upanishads are investigating are really deep connections. It wasn't just about what bandhus are there in the space of a particular ritual, but now the focus is on how the human body is secretly connected to the entire universe, how the microcosm is in fact connected to the macrocosm. So it's big questions. The Upanishadic thinkers were especially concerned with understanding how that ultimate transcendent force called Brahman is connected to the individual self or the Atman that powers each of us, right? And in fact, they claimed to be, as being maybe the biggest bandhu of them all, they claimed that these two things are exactly the same thing. The Brahman is the Atman. Now, even though they had this kind of new focus and new set of claims, we should note that the Upanishads didn't reject the earlier Vedic ritual culture. Instead, what they were trying to do is supplement the worldly concerns of the early Vedas with the otherworldly and innerworldly concerns of this new form of philosophy. So it's also important to note that the Upanishads weren't monolithic in what they were saying. It wasn't like there was just one doctrine that all the Upanishads were preaching. Instead, these texts were coming out at different parts of North India through different lineages of philosophers, and so they were often contradicting each other. But because they were all said to be part of the Vedic canon, right, traditional Hindus view the Upanishads as being just as authorless and timeless as the rest of the Vedas. In other words, the Upanishads are thought to be Shruti and not Smriti. Now, according to historians, of course, the Upanishads weren't timeless. They do have a history, and they seem to appear around 600 BC onwards. They're said to be initially said to belong to one Veda or another, but very soon they become detached from the other Vedic texts and get spread around on their own with the new label of Vedanta philosophy, meaning the end or the essence of the Veda. The Upanishads were themselves quite open-ended. We find that new Upanishads continue to pop up well after 500 BC, even up to medieval times, actually, as late as the 16th century, which sets up a kind of interesting irony where these texts are considered authorless and timeless, yet like people keep finding new ones throughout Indian history. But it does also give you a sense of how important the Upanishads were in Hindu philosophy. If every philosophical school, in order for it to be considered valid, kind of needed to have its own Upanishad, its own revealed text. So what were these Upanishads like as a literature? Here's some general observations we can make about the texts. In their search for true knowledge, the Upanishads were often kind of far more liberal in their outlook than earlier Vedic texts had been. We find that kings, women, outcasts, other non-Brahmin characters often serve to be sources of great spiritual knowledge that regular Brahmins don't have. In fact, they're often shown to be wiser than Vedically trained Brahmins in debates and in discussions. The Upanishads were still written by Brahmin men, to be sure, but you do find kind of more progressive or refreshing attitudes towards women and lower castes in the Upanishads. The Upanishads also really like to tell stories. The stories are usually involve debates or discussions or dialogues between different thinkers, but it's a particular mode of teaching points that becomes a kind of premier method used to illustrate spiritual or moral or doctrinal truths in the Upanishads. And it's a technique that then gets applied throughout Indian religions, even Buddhism and Jainism. Even today, if you go to a wise Hindu guru, you'll see that they teach their disciples about moral or spiritual lessons through telling stories. The Upanishads also seem to have been produced in an urbanizing environment, one that was centered on royal assemblies and trade and travel and craftsmanship. So there's lots of references to making pottery and textiles and metalwork and things like that. The Upanishads reflect a kind of dynamic set of intellectual interactions that seem to have been happening when thinkers from all different parts of North India were coming together and assembling at royal courts or at trading centers or other cosmopolitan spaces in this post-Vedic age. And this was all basically happening for the first time in Indian history, or maybe the second time since it had happened in the Indus Valley period before that. All in all, North India in 500 BC was kind of like a stock market for new religious ideas. Now, one really important idea that gets traded around this time is the concept of karma. We'll be turning to that now and ask how karma came to be such a central issue in Indian philosophy. Now, to understand the ideas of karma and rebirth in the Upanishads, we need to start about what the afterlife would have meant for people living much earlier in that early Vedic period, so before 1000 BC. Mostly in this time period, religious life was focused on practical things, survival, making sure it rains, making sure you have kids, making sure you're healthy, and these kind of things. And so it only makes sense that their idea of the afterlife was a bit rudimentary, maybe. The Vedic cosmos, remember, was split into three. You had the earth, the sky, the heavens, way up behind the deepest reaches of the sky, right? After death, the human souls were thought to go up to that heaven, and you could go into two places. You could either go to the world of the ancestors, the Pitra Loka, or if you've done a superhuman amount of rituals, then your soul gets to go to the world of the gods, the Deva Loka. In the Rig Veda, the word karma has a kind of, it appears in its most simplest form, which just means actions. Any of the things that you do are karmas. Brushing your teeth, making love, killing another person. These are all karmas of one sort or another. But there's ways in Vedic thought, in this early Vedic thought, to kind of supercharge your karmas, your actions, and that's by making them into sacrificial actions. So take the example of killing a goat. Killing a goat just kills the goat, normally. It doesn't do anything else, right? But if you kill the goat as a sacrifice, let's say to Indra, then maybe it can make it rain, or make you have kids, or make you win the battle, that kind of thing. It becomes an action that's now supercharged with an otherworldly power that does greater things than just the action itself. Now, in order to do this, you have to harness Vedic speech, and you have to have the ability to manipulate those bandhus, those deeper connections between the ritual world and the other world. And the results, what are the results of doing sacrificial action? Well, sacrificial action allows you to maintain cosmic order, truth, rita, to gain prosperity or success, to feed the gods and ancestors, give them soma so that they can win against the demons, that kind of thing. That's how karma was conceived of in the early Vedic period. The idea of karma now changes in the late Vedic period. First thing that happens is that you get a totally new cosmology of rebirth that's introduced for the first time in the Brahmana texts. We don't know exactly how, but somehow there came to be this idea that death wasn't a permanent state. You don't just go to either the Pitraloka or Devaloka. Instead, the soul of a person, the Atman, was regarded as permanent and persisting after the death of the physical body. Then something else happens, right? Once the body is gone, the idea is that the soul would travel up through the smoke of the funeral pyre to reach the edge of the sky, where it gets to spend some time in the moon, along with the soma that's also going there from our offerings. Eventually, though, the soul would kind of lose its power to stay in the moon and fall back down to earth in the form of rain. This rain eventually made its way through the chain of life to become plants, animals who ate the plants, eventually human beings. The Sanskrit word for this cyclical process of rebirth is samsara. And the primary cause for this samsara process is karma. It's the actions that you do. Your karma is what pulls your Atman back down to the mortal sphere. And the actions that you do in this life then determine the kind of birth that your Atman is going to take on in the next life. In the late Vedic period, this word karma, earlier it was just restricted to sacrifices, now comes to mean all kinds of action in the world. And all of these get a value judgment on them, right? They have a value based on if they have a positive or negative impact on your samsara process. So if you do good karmas or ritually sanctioned actions, they result in a good future birth. If you do bad karmas, bad birth, that sort of thing. This is true even if the action is inherently violent or harmful, like killing the goat. If it's a ritually sanctioned action, if it's part of your dharma, then it's a good karma. On the flip side, if an action is prohibited, not sanctioned, then it's a bad karma, and it's something that has a negative impact on your future birth. So if you killed that goat because you're mad at the goat, or because you get some sort of sick pleasure from killing the goat, then that killing creates negative karma. The negative karma would lead to consequences that your soul has to endure on the earth, either in this life or in your future lives. All these karmas created kind of an endless cycle of action and consequences, and maybe with it a kind of feeling of maybe hopelessness, since karmic effects that we're enduring today are basically beyond our control, right? And so a new kind of religious concern emerges in this religious environment of the late Vedic period, which is, can it be possible to escape from this endless cycle of karma, rebirth, suffering, right? Can a person gain moksha, that fourth aim of life? And if so, how, right? So different religions come up with different answers. We'll go through them all, actually, in our trip. But there are a few tenets that they're all going to have in common. Yes, it's possible to escape the cycle of rebirth and go to a space of infinitude, right, of pure Brahman that lies beyond the heavens. The sun gives you a brief glimpse, actually, of this blinding space. Right? To do that, to get there, you have to eliminate the bondage of karma, which is what's causing rebirth. All three major religious traditions that grow up around 500 BC, Upanishadic philosophy, Jainism, Buddhism, they are all striving for that goal of liberation, to eliminate karmic bondage. Jains and Buddhists reject the Veda as being kind of like a useless distraction, but for the Upanishads, the new goal of liberation doesn't contradict the older Vedic goals. The only thing is that those older Vedic rituals were oriented towards those three aims of life, right? Dharma, artha, kama, right? Those are temporary, right? The fourth aim, liberation, moksha, was seen to be a higher, more challenging, more permanent destination. And that's where the Upanishads feel like they can help. All right, so with that said, let's kind of bring this session to a close. And the next segment, we'll be turning to one particular Upanishad that used debates and dialogues to philosophize on some of the great questions that surround the issues of karma and rebirth, and the Brahman and the Atman. So let's take a break, and I'll see you in a bit.